The Little Bookroom by Eleanor Farjeon. San Farjeon. Kathy Goodman was picking peas in the front garden of the corner cottage on the village green. She picked them as though she hated them. For 4 years, ever since she had been evacuated, her face had been puckered with a scowl. This was a pity, for Kathy Goodman had been born with a nice face. Old Mrs. Vining was peering through her window in the cottage. She had a bad leg and spent most of her time peering at what went on round the green. Just now she was peering at Kathy to see she didn't eat too many peas, and she also peered at Mrs. Lane, the doctor's wife, and at Miss Barnes, the schoolmistress, who were standing at the edge of the duck pond on the green, staring into it. Miss Barnes was saying, "It's a disgusting sight." "And smell," said Mrs. Lane, screwing up her pretty little nose. "Oh, mon Dieu." Dr. Lane had married her in London a year ago. Everybody in Little Egham liked Dr. Lane and was curious about his French wife. Would she be plain or pretty? She was pretty. Pleasant or standoffish? She was pleasant. Young or old? She was neither. Mrs. Lane was 35, just betwixt and between, a very suitable age, thought Little Egham, for a doctor of 44. Before long they liked her as much as they liked him, for all her funny ways. She was lively and kind and practical and interested in everything and everybody. Her clothes were plain, yet there was something different about them. It was a treat to see her walking up the street. And her cooking, well, she had the same rations as everybody else, but she made them different too. What she could do with a cabbage or a pound of veal would surprise you, so Mr. Fletcher, the vicar, said. Of course, the way she talked was different again, but she talked very well for a foreigner, for she had come to England soon after the last war. And if her ideas and her manners weren't quite what Little Egham was accustomed to, Little Egham found it liked them. Life was somehow a little more amusing in the 12 months that the doctor's wife had lived among them. She was always up to something. Mrs. Vining, peering between her lace curtains, wondered, "What's she up to now?" Mrs. Lane was saying, "How long is it since the pond was cleared out?" "Not since before the evacuees came in 1939, said Miss Barnes. "We'd always been particular about it and never let it be a dump for rubbish. But some of the evacuees were rather a rough lot to begin with. They were at a loose end and used to sit on the rails chucking in anything they could get hold of for the fun of the thing. They settled down, of course, and now they like being here." "Not Kathy Goodman," said Mrs. Lane, glancing towards the corner cottage. The schoolmistress knit her brows. Kathy Goodman was a problem. She didn't fit in. She didn't try to. She had no parents and seemed to belong to nobody. Ever since she had come to Little Egham, she had got the habit of being unhappy and resisted all attempts at friendliness. Miss Barnes hated children to be unhappy, but Kathy's case had got her beat, she said. It's a pity she was put with Mrs. Vining. "Can it not be changed?" asked Mrs. Lane. "Who would take her?" Miss Barnes shook her head impatiently and stared at the pond again. "Goodness, I'd no idea how much had been thrown until this drought. Little Eggam was suffering badly from the drought. The wells were dry, the gardens were parched, and the ponds were showing their bones. The duck pond had shrunk to a smear of green duckweed on the slime in the middle, with a crust of mud all round, in which was embedded a number of disagreeable objects. Salmon tins, sardine and soup tins, rusty kitchen things, and broken bottles. In one part, an old boot, hard as iron, had thrust its wrinkled toe cap through the caked mud, and in the very middle a wooden chair leg stuck up like the mast of an ancient wreck. "It is not nice," said Mrs. Lane energetically. "It is not sanitary. And it is very ugly. It's time it is cleaned out." "I've spoken to Mr. Fletcher about it," said Miss Barnes. "But with labor so short there's no men to spare in the village." "Eh bien," cried Mrs. Lane. "If there are no men, there are women, I hope. I shall clean out the pond myself." "When?" asked Miss Barnes. "After supper," said Mrs. Lane. "I'll help," said Miss Barnes. "We'll want rakes and shuffles," said Mrs. Lane. "I shall put on shorts and the doctor's Wellingtons. 8 o'clock, after we've had our café." "I'll be here," laughed Miss Barnes. She went off gaily to her cottage near the school, and Mrs. Lane crossed to the pretty white house that overlooked the green. They both seemed merry and walked so full of purpose that old Mrs. Vining asked herself again, "What are they up to?" She called through the window to Kathy, "What was Mrs. Lane doin' by the duck pond?" Kathy did not answer. "Aunt, you got a tongue in your head?" rapped out Mrs. Vining. Kathy put it out at her. "Get on with them peas," shouted Mrs. Vining, and added to herself, "One might thought she were expectin' to find a treasure in the pond." Kathy crammed peas into her mouth to stop herself from crying. A treasure. Only she knew about the treasure in the duck pond. Oh, how she hated the duck pond. The duck pond was the reason why, for 4 years, her nice little face had been puckered with a scowl. The treasure in the duck pond was Sand Fairy, and she lay in the mud under the broken chair in the middle. When it settled on her chest and pushed her deep down, she gave up all hope of seeing daylight again. She hadn't seen the light for nearly 4 years. Her frock, made of fine old silk in blue and white stripes with rosebuds dotted down the white stripe, by now her lovely frock must be simply ruined. Her sawdust body felt sadly limp and soggy. Sand Fairy and hoped that her face was still all right. She had been born with a shiny pink and white china face, and glossy black china hair, and big blue eyes, and a little rosy mouth, born long ago in France. Lying under the mud in the green duck pond, Sand Fairy and had lived upon her memories. She thought she must be nearly 80 years old. She remembered a lovely little chateau with turrets and a bridge over a dry moat, and rose gardens and peaches that ripened in the sun, a fairy castle with a lady as pretty as a fairy to live in it. The lady was sewing at a table strewn with bits of brocade and reels of colored silk and a fine lace flounce. Sand Fairy, and with nothing on, was lying amongst the finery. The lady was finishing making a blue and white striped bed jacket for herself, with lace ruffles in the sleeves. A scrap of lace and a piece of the silk were left over. "These will just do for Celestine's doll," she said. She cut the garments deftly and with exquisite stitches made a petticoat of the lace and a frock of the silk. Next day the doll was given to the lady's little girl. It was her jour de fête, her birthday. The child, 7 years old, called the doll Celestine after herself. She loved the doll better than any of her toys, kept her carefully, and years later gave her to her little girl, who was also called Celestine. 30 years after, there was another child called Celestine, and she in her turn treasured her grandmother's doll in its rich dress of old French silk and real lace. The doll supposed she would go on living forever in the fairy castle, belonging to one little Celestine after another. Then the time came when she learned that things don't go on forever. It was the year of the First Great War. Guns boomed all round the castle, and holes appeared in walls, and some ceilings fell in. One night her little mistress ran and clutched her out of her cradle, saying, "We're running away, Celestine. Maman says we must hurry ourselves, but I won't go without you." "Quick, Sherry, quick," called her mother from below. The little Celestine of flesh and blood flew down the stairs, clasping the sawdust Celestine in her arms. Out into the starry summer night, through the sweet-smelling gardens, and across the bridge over the moat, suddenly the child stumbled. The doll fell out of her arms, and a servant who followed kicked it into the moat. "Celestine," cried the child. "Hurry," called her mother. "But Celestine is down there." "Oh, darling, we can't wait." The last thing the doll heard was her little mistress weeping for her. She did not know how long she lay in the moat. Her next memory was of a man in a sand-colored uniform fishing her out of the dead leaves and dusting her off. "Coo," he said, "just the ticket for my kitsy." The guns were still booming, and the fairy castle was fuller of holes than before, and the rose gardens were trampled to bits when the English Tommy carried the doll away. That was her last memory of France. Next, she remembered the soldier unpacking her from his haversack in a little room in England, where his wife was clinging to him, crying for joy, and on his knee was the little girl he called Kitsy. "See what Daddy brought you all the way from France, ducky." "Ooh," said the little girl. "Ain't she loverly? What's 'er name?" "Let's see," said the soldier. He didn't know her name was Celestine, and he said, "Her name's Sanfarrian." "What's it mean?" "Dad?" "Means she's a fairy. See, and'll bring you luck." She loved her because she was a fairy, and because no other doll in the world had such a face or such beautiful clothes. Miss Higgins, the dressmaker, said about her dress, "That's a very fine sample of silk," and about the petticoat, "Well, I do believe it's real lace." But San Fairy and herself was what Kitsy loved most. And San Fairy and she became, first to Kitsy, who loved and treasured her as 3 little French Celestines had done, and then, many years later, to Kitsy's only little daughter, Kathy Goodman. Nobody, not Kitsy, not one of the 3 Celestines long ago, had loved her as much as Kathy Goodman did. Presently, Before the Second Great War broke out, sad things happened in Kathy's life. She was left without parents, and the people who were supposed to look after her neglected her. All she had in the world was Sand Fairy and Sand Fairy and was all the world to her. Then, in 1939, came the World War, and just before it came, Kathy, with a crowd of other children, was evacuated. She fell to the lot of old Mrs. Vining in Little Egham, and that was bad luck, because Mrs. Vining was selfish and crotchety, and had no notion of making a child happy. Still, Kathy would have found friends in the village, and things would have been very different, but for a bit of worse luck that happened on her very first day. There was in Little Egham a boy who was not bright in his wits. Johnny sat in school with the youngest when he was well grown, and Miss Barnes was especially careful and kind with him. There was no harm in Johnny, but he had a weakness for bright things, and when a child complained of missing this or that, Miss Barnes would take Johnny into her room and say, "Now then, you squirrel, let's see what you've got in your dray." Johnny grinned at being called a squirrel and turned out his pockets readily, and there, to be sure, was Dorry Carter's hair slide, mixed up with somebody else's ribbon, bright rose haws from the hedge, and a glass button from goodness knows where. The morning the evacuees arrived, they were welcomed with cups of tea in the Women's Institute, where Johnny loitered to gaze at his face in the metal tea urn. "Keep an eye on the teaspoons," whispered Miss Barnes to her helpers. She knew that Johnny's fingers would itch for them, but soon those fingers itched for something else. Johnny had caught sight of Kathy, sitting forlorn in a corner hugging Sand Fairy, and she was miserable in this strange new place, wondering who would choose her to go home with them, but she got comfort from knowing that she and Sand Fairy and would go together and sleep in the same bed. One day her fairy doll would bring her luck. Johnny came up and grabbed at the doll's silk dress. "Gee, oi, he said. Kathy could only stare at him and hold Sand Fairy and tighter. "Gee, repeated Johnny, and this time Kathy gave him a violent push, crying, "Go away, you horrid little beast." Lady Bridgewater, who was choosing 5 children and had paused by Kathy, passed on, remarking, "I'm afraid you're one of the troublesome little girls." And somehow her ladyship's words stuck. Nobody wanted Kathy, and in the end old Mrs. Vining had her. That evening Kathy stood inside the gate of the corner cottage, showing their new world to Sand Fairy, and it was quiet on the green. Everybody seemed to be at supper. Johnny came by and stared in from the other side. "Gee, he said. "Go away, or I'll tell the policeman on you," said Kathy angrily. She never knew how it happened. Johnny had made a long arm over the fence, snatched Sand Fairy and out of her arms, and scampered off. Kathy flashed through the gate after him and chased him round the green, shrieking, "I'll tell the policeman. I'll tell the policeman." Was it her threat that frightened him out of his small wits? Suddenly Johnny raised his arm and hurled Sand Fairy and far into the middle of the pond. For one moment she swam on her stiff silk skirt. As soon as it got drenched, she sank out of sight. Kathy's screams brought people to their doors. They saw Johnny lying on his back on the green, being scratched and pounded by a furious little evacuee. The children were pulled apart. Johnny couldn't, and Kathy wouldn't explain. She would not show her broken heart to these unfeeling strangers. She would suffer in silence, but oh, how she would suffer. Her pain went deep and shut her lips. She scowled at Johnny. She scowled at the duck pond. She scowled at little Eggham and everything in it. It was a bad start for the troublesome little girl from London. It was why Kathy Goodman had never fitted in and never tried to, but nobody had ever known the reason. At 8 o'clock in the evening, double summertime in July, there are still 3 good hours of light. Old Mrs. Vining, peering as usual, saw children and grown-ups gather in increasing numbers round the duck pond and heard the jokes and chatter and the occasional shouts with which they filled the air. In the middle of the pond stood Mrs. Lane, her sleeves rolled up, her cotton shirt tucked into her shorts, her legs encased in the doctor's rubber boots, her capable hands raking the slime as she passed her findings to Miss Barnes on the hard-caked mud. The children framing the banks made rubbish piles to be carted away tomorrow. Biscuit tin pre-war, announced Mrs. Lane. Cricket ball belonging to William the Conqueror. Tea kettle used by Noah in the Arkansas. Each find was greeted with bursts of laughter and applause. It was as good as a play. The wooden horse from Troy called Mrs. Lane. "Thursday be my owd 'orse," cried Bobby Maitland. I never knowed what 'ad become of E on the edge of the crowd, staring with all her heart in her eyes, stood Kathy Goodman. If Bobby Maitland's wooden horse was found, why not San Farjeon? The hunt went on. 9 o'clock chimed. Mothers began to chase their children to bed. Mrs. Vining screamed to Kathy to come in. Kathy slipped behind a bush and hid. When 10 o'clock chimed, there was almost no one left but Mrs. Lane and Miss Barnes. The green showed 3 big dumps, and not a tin was visible in the pond. San Farjeon had not come to light. Mrs. Lane pushed her hair off her damp forehead with a muddy forearm. "That is all, I think," she said, raking idly in the slime. "Oh, go on, go on, go on," prayed Kathy silently. Dr. Lane leaned over the garden wall of the White House, smoking his pipe. "That's quite enough, Tina. Come along in," he called. "Please, please," prayed Kathy Goodman. "Poof. It has been fun," laughed Mrs. Lane. She pulled herself slowly out of the sucking mud that dragged at her long boots. "Great fun," said the doctor, "if I have you sneezing tomorrow. And do my shoulders ache?" Mrs. Lane wriggled them and crossed the green to her house. Miss Barnes said, "We'll clear the dumps in the morning." And she too went away. The green was empty, except for Kathy crouched behind the bush. Old Mrs. Vining had given her up as a bad job and gone to bed. And San Farjeon still lay under the mud in the middle of the pond. No wonder Mrs. Lane hadn't raked her up. She had been standing right on top of her all the time. 12 o'clock chimed. The doctor was asleep. Mrs. Lane slipped out of bed to smell the jasmine at her window and look at the moon on the green. It was one of the prettiest sights in Little Eggham, but not many people bothered about it. Standing in her pajamas at the window, Tina Lane gazed at the square church tower behind the peaceful elms, the quiet grass where children had played their games for hundreds of years, the darkened cottages, asleep in silver light. Dear little Agam. The church tower might almost be the turret of a fairy castle, thought Mrs. Lane. She caught her breath. What was that muffled sobbing sound in the night, and what was that in the middle of the pond? Had a dog or a sheep floundered in? Oh, mon Dieu, it's a child. Mrs. Lane was down the stairs and out of the house in a flash. In the hall, she snatched up the muddy Wellingtons as she ran and thrust her pajamaed legs into them, scarcely stopping. Within 2 minutes of seeing her from the window, Mrs. Lane was lifting Kathy Goodman out of the slime. They stood clutching each other in the middle of the pond. Kathy was a dreadful sight, soaked with mud, her wet hair streaked with duckweed. Sanfairy Ann, Sanfairy Ann, she sobbed. Kathy Sherry, what is it? Sanfairy Ann, tell me, pauvre petite. I want Sanfairy Ann. Who is she, Sanfairy Ann? You never fished her out. You fished out Bobby's horse, but you left Sanfairy Ann. She's your doll, cried Mrs. Lane, light breaking on her. Stop crying, Sherry. We'll find her if we have to fish all night. And in her own language, she added, smiling, "Ca fate rain." Kathy stopped sobbing and stared. Were people kind, after all, then? Regardless of her pajamas, Mrs. Lane knelt in the mud and groped with both her hands. What was this? Only another tin. She must be careful. Ah, here was something smooth and hard. A stone? She brought it into the moonlight. Not a stone, a china head with glossy black hair, blue eyes, and a rosy mouth. Kathy Goodman turned red with happiness. Sanfairy Ann, she screamed. But Mrs. Lane turned white and said, Celestine. Dr. Lane in his pajamas met Mrs. Lane in hers at the front door. She dripped with mud and clasped in her arms a child and a doll, even muddier. Tina, what on earth? Don't stand asking questions, mon cher. Turn on the hot bath and heat some milk. They all went into the bath, Mrs. Lane, Kathy, and Sanfairy, and whom Kathy would not let go. Her china face and arms and legs soon shone again, but her poor limp body. And her clothes. But what did it matter? Wrapped in a towel, she was lying beside Kathy in a clean bed, while Kathy sipped hot milk. Mrs. Lane, also sipping, sat with her arm round her. Only then did she ask a question. Kathy, where did you get my Celestine? She's not your Celestine. She's my Sanfairy and, yes, Sherry, I know. But when I was a little girl in France, long ago, she was mine. Tell me, my granddaddy bringed her from France for my mummy. Yes, he found her in a castle. Yes, my mummy gived her to me. What do you think, Kathy? My mummy gave her to me. And I cried because I lost her, just like you. She's mine, said Kathy Goodman, very fiercely, very imploringly. Yes, she is yours. She always shall be till you give her one day to your little girl. Tomorrow I will make her a new body and a new dress. Can you guess what Sanfarion's dress shall be?" Kathy shook her head. Mrs. Lane went to a drawer and took out a lovely little jacket made of blue and white striped silk, with rosebuds on the white stripes and lace flounces in the sleeves. "Oh!" gasped Kathy. "This little jacket," said Mrs. Lane, "belonged to my great-grandmother. It was made from one of her granny's dresses. Her granny danced in it when she was a princess in France and lived in a fairy castle." "Oh!" "Tomorrow," said Mrs. Lane, "we will cut it into a new dress for Sanfairy and with a lace petticoat underneath." Kathy stared at her, unable to speak. Suddenly the scowl came unpuckered from her face, and her face was so nice when it smiled that, just as suddenly, Celestine Lane's eyes filled with tears. She put her arms round the little girl and the doll, saying, "And Kathy, would you and Sanfairy and like to stay here and live with me?" "Oh!" gasped Kathy Goodman.